Chapter 30. The Princess. Triggered by the light of the flare, dozens of guns popped out from the buildings just outside the shipyard and began to rain hell down upon the new and improved Bloody Eye. The Bloody Eye was quick to retaliate, instantly turning the docks into a full-blown war zone. The force assaulting the shipyard was a great deal shy of the Syndicate's full power. It was mostly the gang still loyal to the Syndicate, and whatever muscle they had within a 50-mile radius. The firepower, though, was more than enough to challenge the Bloody Eye's recently acquired forces. When the Syndicate put out the order to organize an army to assault the Bloody Eye, many of the rougher gangs failed to answer the call. Near as Mr. Carvel could tell, they had all been quietly folded into the Bloody Eye, drawn by their amazing success. This was a situation the old mobster was trying to prevent by taking Jim's case into his care. He had set Frankie with the task of reducing the gang back to its former self. No one could have guessed he would instead flip the Bloody Eye's vast wealth into a whole new army. Only one man could have been insane enough to launch such a daring grab for power, and everyone was certain he was dead. Somewhere high, overhead of the battle, and far out of the range of most guns, Jim was aboard the VTOL, hardwired into its sensors, and looking over a 3D scan of the area in virtual reality. This scan was not nearly as dramatic as the real-world view, but instead full of quiet colors and ghost-like structures generated by the onboard penetrating radar system. All throughout its scan of the dry-docked ship and the surrounding areas, men were reduced to featureless, colored blobs that floated through a tiny, cold blue, transparent world. While this made their roaring guns invisible, it made their location very apparent, even deep within the ship. Jim was looking for one blob of color that wasn't engaged in battle. This blob, by his estimation, would be frantically moving through the ship, or maybe the surrounding docks. It would be desperately trying to regain control over something radio waves couldn't reach anymore, and that something would be Sarah, and likely several pounds of explosives. Outside the VTOL, attached to the side, a hastily assembled radio jammer was broadcasting static on every potential radio frequency a quasi-competent bomber might use to remotely detonate a bomb. While this would keep Sarah safe for now, it also eliminated all radio communications in the area. If Jim was right, AZ would be barking orders at someone within arm's reach to find out why his hostage was not blowing up. Precious seconds were ticking by as Jim searched the blobs of color again and again. Many were on the move, but all seemed focused on the fight. Nate had a few suggestions for places aboard the ship that AZ could blow up without really damaging the ship itself. He said the detonator probably had a reach of 10 miles, but Jim doubted AZ would keep Sarah too far from his grasp. He would want to keep his greatest leverage close. It had to be someplace secure, so as not to risk one of his goons running off to ransom her himself, and someplace quiet, easy to reach but out of the way. Then he saw it, the one blob that wasn't doing what the others were. It darted out from the basement of a building just outside the ship and quickly headed for a nearby gangway to get aboard. Jim carefully thought over the list of places Nate suggested. The blob moved erratically, most likely as it was being shot at. "Come on, you little devil. Don't die yet. Show me the way," said Jim as he zoomed in on the blob and watched it dart around. It stopped halfway up the gangway for a moment, before safely making it the rest of the way in. "Do you see the target?" asked Matthew. His voice echoed in from all over within the simulation Jim had running. Matthew couldn't spare much more than a voice connection, as he was wired into the VTOL's controls, flying it high above the battle. "Yes, but I don't know where he's going," said Jim as the blob finally reached the deck of the ship. Then the blob moved towards the back. "Wait, I think he's heading for the back of the ship." "You mean the stern?" asked Matthew. "Yes, whatever. Get us into position over it," demanded Jim, uninterested in the accurate name of ship parts. Really, he was happy he even remembered the word gangway. "On it," said Matthew. As he moved the VTOL and approached the back of the ship, the resolution of the scanner increased. The blob took on fuzzy arms and legs, but Jim wasn't interested in the blob so much as where it was headed. Tiny blobs started to appear, roughly rat size. Other blobs near the kitchen were likely food. Then one small blob caught his eye, right in the middle of the ship's bridge. Of course it would be the bridge. He would put her right under the eye of his ridiculous mural. "She's on the bridge. That's gotta be her," shouted Jim. "You better be super sure, Jim. Once I drop you, we'll be completely without communications until the jammer stops," warned Matthew. "It's the perfect place. A shrine to AZ's ego. Can you get me in position for a drop?" asked Jim. "We're above it now. If you want to give me 90 seconds, I can touch down," said Matthew. Jim looked at the blob as it reached the back section and started to ascend the stairs. "No time. I can do a free fall, right?" asked Jim in a hurry. "Oh yeah, time for a power drop. Give me a location and I'll put you on a dime," said Matthew with some measure of excitement. Apparently he looked forward to such things. Jim wasn't. It sounded damn terrifying. Jim used his finger to mark a location 10 feet away from the small blob, in a part of the bridge that wouldn't collapse on top of her. Then he quickly marked the blobs that the blob he had been tracking had departed from earlier. The computer model bleeped and highlighted them in green, with a little pop-up text that said persons of interest. Jim was really interested in killing at least one of those persons of interest, once Sarah was safe. "Keep tracking those, Matt. One of them has to be AZ, said Jim. "All right, so you ready?" asked Matthew. "No, but let's do it anyway. Entering the suit," said Jim. He had a floating button nearby, and instantly the simulation around him vanished, and he was inside the power armor. The body was laying down on top of a large bed of metal, which it was securely clamped into. The fuselage of the VTOL had several of these beds, but besides Jim's, only one other bed was occupied. That suit had Matthew inside, holding him securely while he flew the plane. No sooner had Jim popped in than the bed spun sickeningly around, flipping Jim's robotic body upside down and outside the ship. He hung from the bottom of the aircraft, hundreds of feet over the bridge's roof. The shipyard below was aglow with gunfire and explosions. It would have been kind of pretty if he wasn't about to be dropped, face first, directly into the middle of it. A marker on Jim's view pointed to the real-world spot he had marked in the simulation. A text message warned, communications impaired, while another said, drop zone locked. A large flashing one then popped up that said, automatic descent protocol engaged. While Jim could look, the rest of his body remained under computer control. The clamps that held his robotic arms and legs then sprung open loudly, and Jim started to fall. The suit provided a sense of having an inner ear, so Jim fully felt his virtual stomach lurch as the fall started. The suit continued to control his limbs on its own as it flashed. Automatic descent protocol engaged, along with a rapidly decreasing altimeter reading. Jim didn't need to see any numbers, though, to tell he was falling very fast. The ship shot up to him like a massive hammer as the numbers moved from around 1200 to 0. Larger and larger it grew as the ground moved up to punch him. The suit shifted back from its initial body slam position and into a feet-first freefall. The final numbers left the counter too fast to even see. Just seeing them shoot from 3 digits to just 2 was nearly as terrifying as the fall itself. At the last second, the suit bent its legs ever so slightly as the massive ship rose up to smash him. In an instant, the surreal freefall became an extremely tangible reality as Jim hit the ship. The ceiling of the bridge simply exploded from the impact of the suit's massive robotic feet. Jim punched through it like tinfoil. The floor under the roof resisted much better, but it too buckled quite a bit. In the blink of an eye, Jim was crouched on the gaudy bridge. He stood up from his power crouch like some kind of superhero. It might have looked really cool, but the second he stood up, the chunk of the floor he landed on itself collapsed. Jim fell over backwards into the hole and slammed his robotic back on the floor under the bridge. As he stood up, he slammed drunkenly into some walls that seemed to cave in as he touched them. "Damn it," said Jim as he struggled to move without completely destroying the walls around him. He put a large metal hand through the hole in the ceiling and carefully tried to pull himself up. His heavy body deformed the metal like rubber. As carefully as he could, he pulled his massive frame up through the floor and into the gaudy bridge. As he struggled to pull himself up, he could see Sarah's case on a wooden pedestal, surrounded by a few roses artistically sticking out of several pounds of gray explosives. It was like an altar to her future death. The screen on her case was facing the door, which was also in the direction Jim was in. He could just barely make out a tiny chained woman on the screen in a princess outfit, staring at him in confusion. Just as Jim was halfway out the hole, a very tired-looking Diane burst through the door and immediately stopped there to look at the huge robot that was between her and the case. Jim shoved his hand into a nearby console of the ship, tore it from the floor like it was made of paper, and tossed the metal mass at the door. Diane leaped back just as the metal mass slammed in the door frame, completely blocking the door in a single motion. "Fuck this shit!" yelled the frightened psycho as she turned to flee down the hall. "Tell AZ I'm coming for him!" yelled out Jim as he pulled himself out of the heavily damaged floor. He crawled forward carefully like he was walking on thin ice. "Is that you, Jim?" asked the small princess on the screen. "Yeah," said Jim as he tried to stand up and accidentally crushed the disco ball with his head. A rain of glass fragments showered the massive robot. Jim shook off the glass shards and said, "I got an upgrade." "I think you might have overdone it." "But I'm so glad to see you," said Princess Sarah. Jim reached out for Sarah's case, but then she shouted, "Don't touch me! There's some kind of switch under my case." Jim froze in place and looked at the explosives under Sarah's case. He didn't know much about bombs, but while it didn't look like it had enough to completely destroy the bridge, it certainly appeared to have more than enough to destroy Sarah. "Okay, maybe Nate can walk me through disarming this," said Jim as his robotic body leaned in closely to the small pedestal in Sarah's case. Then Matthew's voice blared in Jim's ear. "The jammer just blew a circuit! Get Sarah out now!" Jim looked around in panic. He couldn't just grab her case. He couldn't disarm the bomb. At any moment, AZ was going to realize his detonator was working again. What could he do to save her from the explosives? Jim looked back at the door, and then an idea hit him. "God, I hope this works," said Jim as he spun around. He reached behind himself and tore out one of the other consoles from the floor like so much tinfoil. He pulled the sheet metal free in a massive strip and wrapped it around his arm, over and over, until he had a layered tube of metal. "What are you doing?" asked Sarah. She didn't seem panicked, blissfully unaware that the last seconds of her life were drawing close. "If this doesn't work, I won't be able to live without you," said Jim somberly. "What are you about to do, Jim?" asked Sarah with concern. "I love you," said Jim as he lifted the tube over Sarah's case. "You what?" said Sarah in shock. Then Jim slid the thick metal tube around Sarah's case, cupped his large metal hand under the tube without moving Sarah's case off the pedestal, and then flicked up the tube in Sarah's case while spinning his upper body to the side. Instantly the pedestal erupted in fire and smoke. The sound might have deafened Jim and Sarah, but both only heard a crackling sound as their microphones reached maximum volume and cut out. Jim held the tube close to his heavy body like a very large metal baby, one hand still cupping the bottom. If he failed, he was holding Sarah's corpse. Jim walked in a direction he was certain had to be towards the outside catwalk. He moved slowly through the black smoke of the destroyed bridge, until he felt some resistance in the groan of metal. Then he pushed a bit more, with his shoulder until the metal gave way, carefully moving past the wall he had just torn open. As he did, smoke poured out of the room and his vision cleared. Jim was certain the suit had other forms of vision, but he couldn't bring himself to use anything except the basic cameras. If Sarah was dead, he wanted to see it with something like human eyes, not some sort of colorful predator vision. The voice of Matthew came in on the radio. "Jim, I saw an explosion. Are you okay? Is Sarah all right?" Jim mumbled back, "I don't know." As the smoke cleared, Jim lowered his cupped hand. But Sarah did not slide out as he had hoped. The sheet metal on the outside was badly dented. "Oh, God," said Jim as he looked at the metal. Slowly he peeled back a layer of it, and the sheet under was dented a bit less. Jim continued to carefully unroll the damaged metal, and the next layer was even less damaged. He dared not get his hopes up too quickly. He would simply stop living if he had to feel the pain of losing her twice. The next layer was even less dented and had no char. Finally, Jim unwrapped the last layer. It was close to the case, and with it fell out bits of slightly crushed camera and screen. But on the broken screen was a very much living Sarah. "Thank God! Oh, thank God!" said Jim. A profound sense of relief made him weak at the knees, but the robotic body remained standing. Sarah was saying something, but the speaker on the outside of her case fell out as Jim had unwrapped the last layer. "You got her, Jim?" hesitantly asked Matthew. "Yeah, bring the car around. Let's get her out of here," said Jim with great relief. "All right, coming down," said Matthew. The VTOL was almost invisible while high in the air. Its black exhaust system only produced light in a non-visible spectrum. Jim knew this because Matthew bragged on and on about how stealthy the aircraft was. It was almost completely invisible at night. Jim couldn't even guess where it was as it descended. As it got within a few hundred feet, though, its dull black skin captured the light, and it slid out of the darkness like a shadow made solid. The sound it made was quiet by jet standards, but still louder than the gunfire below. Jim stood on the edge of the railing, holding on to the torn hole he had made in the wall with one hand, while gently clutching Sarah's case in the other. It was remarkable how gentle the suit could be holding something when the user desired it. "Let's make this quick, Jim. Some of those green dots you wanted to keep an eye on are heading up here," said Matthew over the radio. "Good. It'll make them easier to find when I go back down there to kill a lot of them," said Jim menacingly. The large VTOL gracefully slid up to the ship. It nimbly approached as the back hatch came down. Matthew had it so well under control he gently touched the door to the edge of the railing, even though it was as big as 2 buses. But just as Jim was about to step on the aircraft, there was a flash, and a chunk of the aircraft's side disappeared in a rain of smoke and debris. The VTOL lurched towards Jim, but he used his large robotic shoulder to shove it off before it crushed him and Sarah. The craft lurched drunkenly several degrees and started to drift away from the ship. "She's been hit! I'm going down!" said Matthew over the comms. Then something else exploded inside the plane, and the VTOL started to spin with great masses of smoke pouring out its dark body. A few seconds later, it smacked down into the water. It looked like it might float for a second, but the weight of the water pouring in caused it to roll rapidly to the side, and it began sinking fast. Matthew's staticky voice blared in over the radio. "Taking on water! Switching to! I'll be!" And then the voice cut out entirely. The craft completely disappeared under the rocking ocean surface, with only a trail of bubbles to mark its resting place. "Matthew!" yelled Jim over the radio, but nobody was there to listen. Jim looked around, and 100 feet away on the deck below, standing proudly with some kind of rocket launcher in hand, was AZ. Then he slid something else into the barrel of the device. It was conical, like a rocket, but it didn't go all the way inside. Jim was certain he saw something like it in the movies. Then he took aim at Jim with it. Jim threw up a hand towards AZ and tucked Sarah's case on the other side of his body. In the movies, a rocket launcher like what AZ was holding would show a rocket flying out when fired. In some movies, it was even slow enough to catch. Jim wanted to pull off that catch, but this wasn't slow. The real-life version happened instantly. There was a flash, and Jim's robotic hand, along with his entire arm, just disappeared into a fireball. The blast shook Jim's heavy robotic body and shredded some of the wall and catwalk around him with debris. Jim managed to keep standing and himself between Sarah and the explosion, but when the smoke cleared, his left arm was just gone. All that remained was a small stump of twisted metal dangling from the shoulder. Somewhere in the back of Jim's mind, he remembered what the device was called. An RPG.